I'm Katie Hassan, the Associate Director of Center for Genetics and Society. I'm a woman in my 40s with curly, chin-length red hair and pale skin. I'm wearing glasses and a black blouse with a floral pattern. Many thanks to our captioner and to our ASL interpreter, Polly Newstead. Before we begin, CGS would like to acknowledge that we work on the ancestral and unceded land of the Ohlone people. We know that acknowledgement is not enough, and we commit to supporting Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous-led organizations in our work. Today's webinar is the third in a series organized through CGS's Missing Voices Initiative, which aims to bring into the conversation on heritable genome editing the essential voices of civil society advocates and scholars committed to social justice and human rights. If you haven't yet seen the previous webinars, including our recent symposium, Genetic Justice from Start to Summit, we hope you'll check out the recordings and transcripts on the CGS website. Today, we have a stellar lineup bringing an intersectional lens to the discussion of reproductive uses of genome editing. And by this, we mean altering the DNA of eggs, sperm, or early embryos for use in reproduction, resulting in a genetically modified child, also referred to as heritable genome editing or germline modification. This practice is broadly opposed by civil society advocates, scientists alike, and many in between. It is currently prohibited in over 70 countries. If it were to be allowed, it would roll out in the profit-driven and poorly regulated global fertility industry. This makes it urgent to engage feminist critiques of the industry, from the lack of research into long-term health effects of egg retrieval to the potential for exploitation in cross-border commercial surrogacy. We also need to situate these discussions in broader critiques of reproductive oppression and eugenics. All of these would bring needed attention back to the women and pregnant people who would undergo IVF and carry, give birth to, and care for gene-edited babies. This is another way that putting the seemingly missing voices at the forefront can fundamentally change our discussions of this powerful emerging technology. I'd like to now turn things over to Susan Berke Fogel, the moderator for today's discussion. Susan is a co-founder of the Pro-Choice Alliance for Responsible Research and an attorney and consultant to nonprofit organizations working on reproductive health and rights issues. Thanks so much, Susan.
Thank you, Katie. I am a getting older white woman. I am bald and wearing red glasses and a dark brown shirt and silver jewelry. You know, it's incredible to think that the first IVF baby was born just 44 years ago. And there's so much that we still don't know. We know little about the long-term health effects on women who undergo IVF for themselves or who provide eggs for third parties. We also know little about the long-term health of the babies who were born. After all, they're only 44 years old. They're younger than I am. And still technology marches on, too often unchallenged. We, however, are grappling with these technologies in the larger context of tremendous inequalities across the world at the intersections of gender, race, class, opportunity, environment, disability, and power that currently exist. Forced sterilization, coerced sterilization, and environmental toxins are robbing low-income women and women of color of the decision-making dignity to decide when and if to have a child. And at the same time, the global for-profit fertility industry is offering childbearing options with a menu of trait selections to those who can afford to buy them. These new technologies are bringing greater disparities and across these different sectors, but they're being marketed as curing disease, ending disability, parental choice, scientific progress, when they're really the embodiment of the new eugenics, demonizing people with disabilities and vastly exacerbating the great disparities that already exist. It's a complicated subject, and we're really glad that you're here for it. And luckily, our panel is ready to take on these challenges. So let's get it. Our first speaker is Kavita Ramdas, who is a globally recognized advocate for gender equity and justice, who provides high-level consulting advice and guidance on initiatives to defend democracy and protect human rights, both within the United States and across the globe.
Thank you, Susan. I am a older woman with silver hair and a Indian bindi on my forehead. I have light brown skin, and I'm wearing a patterned shirt with Indian cross-stitch embroidery. I'm really glad to be with you all today. Salam and namaste. I would like to begin my comments with following on the framing that Susan has given. As somebody who did not grow up in the United States, I think it's really important for us to situate this whole conversation within a larger reality of power dynamics that exist across the globe between those who have had power and who have exercised that power in the rest of the world, particularly in colonial forms. I think it is very difficult for people to understand, just as the first IVF baby is only 44 years old. The first country to become independent post 1940, post the Second World War, was India from colonial rule, India and Pakistan together. That's only 75 years ago. And our experiences as colonized countries, most countries in the African continent gained their freedom much later, in their 60s. That relationship of power between the countries that have had and that have not had vast economic, military, and political power over other countries has meant that the relationships have translated into almost every sphere, including the spheres of reproductive rights, of reproductive choice, and of the ways in which we envision our futures. Some examples of that: the fact that it makes it very easy to look for surrogates in countries where women struggle to find any kind of adequate employment or fair pay. The fact that it makes it possible for people in much of the developing world to see surrogacy as some form by which they may make sure that their families can eat, or that their own existing children have the chances to be able to go to school, to have a better future. These complex realities are something that I think we rarely take into account when we are discussing this, because for the most part, these conversations are happening in the global north, where your technology has already gone to a point where people are feeling like, oh, this is a question of choice, or this is a question of what I want for my children. One more aspect of this is that there is a huge way in which the questions around genetics are used to propose using women's bodies in the global north to really be seen as baby manufacturers. What do I mean by that? Some years ago in Germany, there was a campaign to bring more Indian guest workers in on visas to be able to work in the computing sector. The right wing mobilized against this with huge campaigns with signs that said, Kinder statt Inder. Women should have children instead of us hiring Indians. This is not that far away from the we shall not be replaced. There is a almost an obsession with trying to increase birth rates amongst nations where they feel that the ethnic majority is losing its majority, and that therefore that needs to be replaced with pushing women to actually bear children, and thereby advance the objectives of the nation state. I think that this is a deeply macho understanding of what it means to be a nation, and is deeply grounded both in, as Susan talked about, issues of eugenics, as well as in ideas around racial superiority. I want to say two more words about where I am in my work, which has been primarily in the field of philanthropy. I'm deeply concerned that philanthropy tends not to think about the intersections between these different areas of work. So if you're a philanthropy that funds science, you're really thinking about women's rights. If you're a philanthropy that funds women's rights, you're really thinking about science. You're not thinking that gender and equity are actually built into almost every single thing that you do. And I think that there is a long history of, and particularly in the country that I grew up in India, where the foreign foundations, both the Rockefeller Foundation and Ford Foundation, that were involved with supporting population control in India, trying to bring the birth rate down in the 60s, was viewed with great suspicion by women's rights movements, and through an understanding that this was a way to control the birth of brown people. So let me end by saying that I think there is also a deep resistance in the global north to thinking about ways in which they can decrease consumption and look at population more as a way to basically have control over what the rest of the world consumes, rather than decreasing their own amounts of consumption. And I look forward to discussing this with my panelists next. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you so much. There's so much to think about. Our next speaker is Amrita Pande. She is a professor and chair of the Department of Sociology at the University of Cape Town. Her research revolves around globalization and the intimate, with a focus on reproductive labor and new reproductive technologies.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Kavita, for that. I'm going to follow almost immediately from what Kavita just said. I'm Amrita, speaking from my home office in Cape Town, South Africa. I'm a woman with brown skin in my 40s. I have chin length, curly brown, partly graying hair, and I'm wearing a blue-green jacket. First, I really do want to start by thanking Katie and the CGS team for inviting me to be part of this stellar panel, and for building this community around some very urgent questions. What I want to do today is, in some sense, connect my work on the global fertility industry with the potential use of heritable gene editing for reproductive purposes, essentially what Susan outlined and Katie outlined, germline editing at the stage of IVF. And as Susan and Katie have hinted at that, there's been a long list of past and current eugenic practices in many parts of the world, which bear adequate testimony, I think, to the fact that the desire, the temptation to genetically modify the future generation in a hunt for an assumed perfect race, perfect baby, perfect future generation is not mere dystopia. And in today's world, advocating for a technology which aims to genetically modify future generations in a world that is becoming increasingly unequal, divided, politically conservative, and right-wing, as Kavita was pointing out, is acutely dangerous. Yet we find media, scientific communities, academies, and the professional elite celebrating these new technologies as if they are miraculous. And although many of these advocates have recently, and this was quite evident at the summit, they have started taking cognizance of the moral and ethical quandary of such technology, almost always these critical questions, what we think are critical questions of justice, are dismissed by simply drawing a boundary between safe, unsafe, good and bad use of these technologies, and of course, responsible and rogue scientists. Accepting this binary, I think, is simply naive. While advocates of these technologies believe and would have us believe that heritable genome editing will benefit society, let's just call a spade a spade. Heritable genome editing is not about celebrating our unlimited choices as individuals. It's about eliminating undesirable traits in a future generation. And I want to focus on these undesirable, what these undesirable traits are likely to be based on my experience of researching on and working with intended parents or clients, whatever you want to call them, and professionals in the global fertility industry. I've worked quite a bit with gestational surrogates and cross-border gestational surrogates and egg providers across the world, but I'm going to focus mainly on racialization and the inherent whiteness of this industry. But it goes without saying that the fundamental base of this industry is to select out disability. And we can talk about that in the discussion. So for the past decade, or actually more than that now, almost 2 decades, I've been trying to fully understand the transnationality of the fertility industry by conducting research in 3 related sites. And I think it's important to quickly talk about what these sites are, because they will give you a kind of hint as to the transnationality of the process now and the way the market has flushed into the global south. So the 3 related sites I worked with are the preparation of egg providers by global egg agencies in South Africa, the egg retrieval and making of embryos in a global fertility clinic in India, and finally the transfer of embryo into the womb of a gestational mother in either Cambodia or Ghana. And the intended parents who I've interacted with in these global fertility clinics are predominantly international. Essentially, these global egg banks and clinics are satellite spaces with little to do with local laws, national laws, or even the national intended parents. So what is relevant for our conversation here is what these satellite spaces, what I call global fertility clinics, have allowed in the name of choices, desires about the future generations. And what is really critical for us to understand is that these choices are not individual or innocuous, but they are fundamentally shaped by coloniality, post-coloniality, and if I may just steal Sara Ahmed's phrase, a desire for proximity to whiteness. I'm recalling this interview with The Wire where Marcy, our very own Marcy, provided some great provocations, where sociologist James Hughes remarked that he's not worried about choices about eye color and hair color, as that's not going to increase inequalities in our society. So Hughes, I believe, like many others, thinks that such technologies can improve our life as long as they are controlled democratically. And this belief actually resonates with the whole genre of scholarship on what is called liberal eugenics, biopolitics that is allegedly driven by individual choice rather than by the state. But what we are seeing in the global fertility world is that this binary between the so-called old eugenics and new or liberal eugenics is actually very misleading. States, by allowing the fertility industry to operate unhindered, are essentially reaffirming existing structures of inequality and legitimizing new forms of race and gender-based inequalities. So I'll give you some very quick examples because I don't have that much time. But for what I've noticed that in the human egg industry in South Africa, where I am located right now, and South Africa feeds very much into the global fertility industry, the entire human egg industry that feeds into the global world is inherently white. And what an irony, because this is 95% Black African majority. In fact, in the global fertility world, I'm yet to meet even one Black African egg provider. And this inherent desirability of whiteness, what I call inherent desirability of whiteness is reproduced in two ways. Did I hear something from Katie about my time? Oops. Okay, time is up. Okay, so I'll just summarize by saying that it's in two ways, which is that one is, which is very familiar to all of us, which is that it is intended parents want a racial match. But the most interesting thing is that many intended parents from Asia actually want strategic hybridization. That is, they want white mixed race babies. And what these desires give you is more than a hint as to what traits are considered socially undesirable and what traits are considered desirable. And this is what is happening right now. It's not speculation or dystopic fiction.
Oh, my. Yes, thank you. Our last but absolutely not least speaker is Alana Cattapan. She is the Canada Research Chair in the Politics of Reproduction and an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. She studies gendered inclusion in policymaking, identifying links between the state, the commercialization of the body, and reproductive labor.
Hi, everybody. Oh, yeah, I'm unmuted. Thank you, Susan. I'll start by saying that I'm coming to you as a settler and uninvited guest on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Neutral peoples in what's come to be called Waterloo, Ontario, in Canada. I'm a white woman in my late 30s with shoulder-length brown hair, wearing a beige lace blouse and a black blazer. And behind me are foolish books on a brick wall, and I'll probably be drinking from a colorful mug throughout. Thank you for having me. I'm really pleased to be part of an esteemed panel, and I'm really thankful to the participants, but also to CGS for inviting me. And I'll say that a lot of the remarks that I'm going to make overlap a great deal with what's already been said from Katie, from Susan, from Kavita, and Amrita. So hopefully I don't repeat too much. But I'm a political scientist, and my work in this field has largely focused around feminist approaches to the governance of reproductive and genetic technologies, and how we involve often excluded communities from conversations about how we govern these things. And at the heart of my work are concerns about reproductive autonomy and justice, and how to engage in the governance of reproduction in ways that are not only ethical, but also address our responsibilities to future generations. So heritable genome editing, as we all know, we've been talking about, is the most recent in a long history of reproductive and genetic technologies for which there is a renewed call to engage because they are now possible. And with the assumption that because they are now possible, they might offer some sort of benefit to human society. It is, as someone said before, a real cart before the horse situation. It's important to recognize from the outset that this is a technology for which there is no clear medical need. There are already existing genetic testing interventions that they raise their own set of concerns, but they can intervene to prevent certain genetic conditions without modifying the germline. So like from the outset, we may not need heritable genome editing at all. In fact, I would argue, many of you would argue that is the case. And I have a few concerns that I'll outline in the time I have. The first is about who gets to decide about how we proceed with heritable genome editing. As Amrita, you said, our very own Marcy has outlined before, really beautifully, Marcy, in your introductions to the Missing Voices Initiative programming prior to the start of the last International Summit on Genome Editing earlier this month. The statements and reports of scientists and bioethicists that have organized these large international summits reveal an understanding that it is that community that will attempt to articulate when it's appropriate for human germline editing to proceed, for heritable genome editing to proceed. Shifting commitments to obtaining, quote, broad societal consensus, and then later, quote, public engagement, and then broad scientific consensus suggests that self-regulating scientists believe that they are at the helm of determining the conditions under which heritable genome editing could be permissible. The rest of us are not seen to be part of that conversation, and this particularly excludes people with disabilities who have a tremendous stake, but we all do, in this intervention. And I just want to highlight, this also doesn't even mention, and I haven't heard this conversation much, although somebody mentioned it earlier, the providers of the gametes and egg donors in particular, who will in the short term undergo a necessary ovarian stimulation and extraction to have their eggs removed for use in genetic editing. There are concerns about the consent of those people, about the modification of their germlines, their genes. Where are they in this conversation? To paraphrase Donna Dickinson's work on embryo research, the lady vanishes again and again. So in the wake of this third international summit on genome editing, it seems strange to keep entertaining the conversation as to whether it is necessary to keep talking about whether to pursue heritable genome editing at all. It's true that the possibilities enabled by CRISPR-Cas9 and subsequent uses of that technology in at least one case to create children, probably more, I assume, necessitated another look as to whether longstanding prohibitions on heritable genome editing that have existed in more than 70 countries should be revisited, because it was worth looking at whether the concerns that informed those prohibitions in the first place have been addressed in the meantime. But it's clear that they have not. Heritable genome editing continues to be unsafe, unnecessary, and to pose a significant threat to the value and diversity of human experiences. And it is already prohibited in many places. So my second concern here is about the persistence of this conversation, and that we're already in that conversation working to set up exclusion and legitimating the possibility of judging which lives are worth living. So I'm not going to rehearse this too much. Amrita did a really tremendous job, and others have before me. But some of these conversations about potential future permissibility and regulatory oversight revolve around an attempted distinction between therapeutic editing versus edits to the genome for purposes of enhancement. And editing the germline provides, like, this conversation about heritable genome editing and whether or not to proceed provides a framework for these discussions, a site in which to make determinations around what traits and experiences and potential disabilities are desirable and undesirable, and what counts as healthy. And in this, there is it harkens back, I suppose, to colonial and imperial discourses imbued with scientific racism about who gets to count and who gets to decide what kinds of traits and ideas are desirable. But Amrita has covered this quite well. Desirability, though, is a moving target that tends to land on those most marginalized, and one that has often centered and will continue to center on people with disabilities. Katie, I see you, and I'm really quickly going to say one more concern. I want to address not just the whether, but the how. So if this debate about whether we're going to engage in heritable genome editing continues, even though it remains prohibited in many countries, and it seems it will, there is a persistence amongst those who are advocating for its use, and there's this continued push to allow a heritable genome editing, we can't stop our conversations about whether it should be permitted, but we also need to start talking about how it might, like what it might look like to engage as ethically as possible together. Katie signaled to this in her introductory remarks, but there needs to be a meaningful conversation about the governance and more specifically the economic model in which heritable genome editing may occur. As others have mentioned, the international fertility industry is worth billions of dollars, and this is compounded by potential economic incentives related to the patenting of genetic technologies and their potential use. So it's entirely possible, it's probably occurring already, that the use of heritable genetic modification will be a site of private medicine and of private profit, rather than a site of global collaboration. And if this is in some way going to benefit humanity, a site of potential shared benefit. So if the persistence of the scientific community in pushing towards heritable genome editing is successful, the model here matters. It's critical that the incentives of neoliberal capitalism and the maximization of profit do not inform decisions about what kinds of genetic editing is permissible, and that the perceived benefits are not just a site of profit built on the backs of future generations. So Katie, I see you, I'll stop there. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much. So much to think about. And what we'd like to do now is to invite our three speakers to react to what we've already heard before we kind of open it up for maybe some questions. So how about if we just do a roundtable and start again with Kavita?
Thank you so much. And I neglected to add my thank yous to the Center for Genetics and Society and Marcy and Katie and all of you. I'm so proud to serve on their advisory board. A few reflections that I don't have the depth of academic knowledge and research studies that my other two amazing colleagues have put forward, but I think I will say that in a career of almost 30 years of working within US and global philanthropy, a few things come to mind that make me really quite concerned when I hear about the degree to which this is such a challenge. One, my colleague Elisa Slattery, who I believe is on the webinar and who worked with me at the Open Society Foundation, was one of the few people at the Open Society Foundations, and indeed at any foundations, to understand that the fundamental work we do in reproductive health and rights must be grounded in a connection to an understanding around research and a connection to work in science. It has been very difficult indeed for an organization like CGS to raise funds because the people who fund women's rights, who are funders of women's rights, are basically active in supporting what they consider to be women's movements on the ground. And yet our inability to see that the women's movements on the ground don't have the ability to actually, because of the power dynamics that I spoke about earlier, that often they are excluded from places of science. Both Alana and Amrita have made that point. When you are excluded from those spaces, you don't even know what is being discussed. So how can you be having a movement that is taking that on as a major issue? So it really behooves foundations who have money, who have resources, to really make those connections. In a similar way, an analogy I'll give to this is that it took women's movements a very long time before they connected with economics. My other colleague, Dr. Marina Durano, who worked with me, is a feminist economist. And she will tell you that it was in the Ni Una Menos movement in Argentina, which began with issues of bodily safety and women arguing about the safety of their bodies. It didn't take long for that movement to realize that Argentinian debt and what it meant for individual Argentinian women was as much of an issue for a feminist movement as questions of violence and reproductive rights. So I would urge us to begin to think in a very different way, because I think the issues that both Amrita and Alana are putting on the table cannot remain in the academy, cannot remain in the hands of scientists. And in order for them not to be stuck in that space, they must in fact be connected to women's rights movements on the ground. And that will take financing, that will take support for organizations like CGS, and it will take a much more intersectional approach to understandings of power, science, and economics. Thank you.
Yes. Amrita, you want to respond to what you've heard?
Sure, thanks, Susan. And I think listening to Kavita again was very helpful. And what Alana also said about who gets to make these decisions. So this completely embedded in power dynamics. And if we were really wanting to change the frame, we would need to perhaps pivot the center and start looking at it from the point of view of the global South. And as soon as you start thinking about these new technologies from the global South frame, then you realize that there are huge opportunity costs of investing in these technologies. And even if they are for research purposes, and these opportunity costs are enormous. So gamete editing, for instance, is likely to benefit only a really minuscule number of intending parents. And while the cost of these technologies, whenever they are made available to people for reproductive reasons, are so high that it's unlikely to be accessed by those who need it most. So those demographies, for instance, where infant mortality is the highest. So if the goal at the end is to have a healthy baby or a healthy genetically related baby, if you want that, and we want to use these technologies in ways that is most effective for many, then we must look at the figures, because as far as I I don't quote me on this, but over 5 million children under 5 years of age die annually from preventable and treatable causes like diarrhea, malaria, and we'll go a much longer way in allowing intending parents to have and keep healthy genetically related babies if we invested in those. And these kind of opportunity cost argument is really important and important to bring up in all our discussions with these professional elites.
Thank you. And Alana?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to unmute as usual. So there's two maybe pieces I'll pick up on from the conversation so far. One is, again, this question of regulation. How do we decide who engages in the conversation and in decision-making here? And Amrita, when you said democratization, it like lit up bulbs in my mind because I'm a political scientist and I want to talk about democracy all the time. But the democracy has never been, or a democratic approach has never been an effective way to protect minority groups, which is why many countries have bills of rights. That's why we have established human rights to protect groups from their governments, from decision-making that might be poor, that might be made by masses of people that aren't necessarily in favor of protecting the human rights of those most marginalized. And so democracy maybe isn't the way forward here. Perhaps it is not a broad societal consensus that we're looking for, but a view that centers those who would be most marginalized in this experience. I keep thinking now, I wrote down so many notes that make no sense, taken out of context, but I also want to stress something that's come out of this conversation, which is the desire for genetically related babies, right? That this entire conversation about human germline genetic modification is about an ongoing committed desire to genetically related babies and ensuring that those babies have desired traits, as many of us have talked about. But this isn't the only way to build families. There is an ongoing and strong commitment of many governments to certain kinds of family forms that we can question, that we can challenge and keep challenging, where we are not prioritizing genetic relationships at the center of our family building.
Yes.
Susan, can I add one more point?
Oh, please do.
I think it's very important to say that quite absent this next level of scientific abilities that would be made possible if this genetic editing of the kind we've been discussing is made possible, we already live in a world where we are deeply influenced by cultural assumptions, by things like sun preference. You don't even need this kind of genetic testing, because in India right now, we're not even allowed under the law to use ultrasounds to determine the sex of a child, because there is such a strong preference for male children that female children are routinely aborted. And Amartya Sen has written this, important assessment talking about the missing women of India. India is not alone in this. China had a similar experience. Korea had a similar experience. The other piece of this is that so all I'm saying is, if we are going to translate the existing biases of our society that are already deeply gender unequal, then why would we not expect those same biases, whether they are pro-whiteness, whether they are pro-male, whether they are pro, whatever, lighter skinned, taller, whatever the predilections are, to translate into this new technology. And I think even as we see with AI chat, which is another area, it's not in bio science, but it is in another area. If you have patriarchal and racist attitudes that are already internalized in the algorithms that these new technologies are using, then it really doesn't matter what unique thing and ableist actually, and deeply ableist assumptions. Then even with the technology that we currently have, we are dealing with a set of choices that people are making because they can see what works or doesn't work, or what is privileged in their society. So I just want us for a second to remember that we're already working in a space in which these assumptions and in which these biases are being internalized not just in our societies, but also in the algorithms that are just racing forward in every other space, not just in the space of gene editing.
Susan, do you mind if I build on that a little bit? Okay. I just wanted to add that there are, that the ongoing biases in society will be replicated no matter what the technology is, as Kavita has just said. And so what we need to be questioning in the presence, and this might respond to one of the questions that has come in, to concerns about the use of this technology, because there's no medical need, there's no real need. So why pursue it? This is the question I've been sort of grappling with in the last few days as I've been thinking about my remarks today. And there is a strong incentive towards, as I said before, innovation and progress in science, incentive mechanisms, both for the prestige of scientists, but also the desire to do something new, to somehow be moving humanity forward, this language of progress that is, again, bound up with notions of linear notions of time, but also linear notions of the way advances, I suppose, like scare quotes all over that, in the human race. And so here we need to question the way that we structure science, right? This isn't just about scientific self-regulation, but also incentives in the scientific establishment. What is seen to be prestigious, what is seen to be helpful, what is seen to be funded. And that too is bound up with notions of patenting and intellectual property and capitalism. And so these things can be unpacked. It is possible with great imagination.
Thank you. I'm thinking about what you're saying in the sense of what we already have is a global fertility. Sorry about that. But raising these issues of not only of where we are now, not only where this technology could take us, where we have a global fertility industry where people are encouraged, who are using provided eggs or sperm, are already encouraged to choose hopeful traits, right? So, they look at somebody's bio and how, whether they're athletic or they're musical or what color eyes they have. And some of this is fed by the desire to have, if not a biologically connected child, a child that looks like us, which is rooted in the biological, right? As soon as a child is born, someone wants to know, who do they look like? So I would, really be interested in your reactions to, is this seen as the next step? If people are already, although those choices obviously are not guaranteed because that's not how bodies work. But is this seen as a logical next step? I appreciate Alana in particular using the word dangerous. But how do you think about that in terms of how this industry is evolving?
Amrita, I don't know if you would like to respond to that first.
Yeah, sure. I can go ahead, Kavita and Susan, because the way this industry will expand, I mean, it's already expanded way beyond the scientific impulse. And I think that's what's so dangerous about these new technologies, is that even if we want to assume that the scientific impulse was only noble, once it reaches the market, it has a life of its own. And in response to what you raised, Susan, and what someone raised in the Q&A, we often want to think of new technologies as modern, as something that we can actually find benefits of. It will ultimately, of course, it's new, right? The word new, it's modern. It has to somehow improve human lives, and we just have to find ways of regulating it. But this is the problem, is that very often these kind of new technologies are so easily legitimized on the ground that it will further human well-being, that it will take care of those people who are most vulnerable, those suffering the most. But I think it's really important to bring back onto the table this question of what does it mean to improve human lives. And again, I think I come back to pivoting the center and thinking about the global south and thinking about what does it really mean to improve human lives? And is that concept of improvement universally accepted? I mean, in general, gene editing works to eliminate human traits that are considered to be either a disease or a disability, right? And we haven't talked too much about disability justice yet. And what disease and disability, in a sense, are seen as traits that diminish human capacity. But if we were to now foreground disability justice, we will get a very different way of looking at the problem and hence different solutions. So diseases, disorders, ability, disability are all politically and socially constructed, and they vary from culture to culture and vary over time. And so there is no universal definition of disease or disability. So in a sense, eliminating a disease or disability, which seems to be the paramount concern, or at least the paramount legitimizing ground for these technologies, is actually about eliminating variation, which we cannot support, or which is very inconvenient for society. So for each disease, actually, there are treatments that can make quality of life worth living. But the fundamental of selecting out a variation is that certain traits are just thought to be inconvenient, and we take this decision, somebody who we allow to take decisions takes this decision that this needs to be eliminated from humanity. And it goes back to the question that Alana, you asked, who takes these decisions and who do we allow to take these decisions? It's basically a lack of will for social change, which is legitimizing such extreme action.
I'm just going to add, I'm being like very cautious about intervening. I'm worried about catching up with captions. And I want to just add to what Amrita has just said about the centering of disability justice, that and this is also to answer one of the questions that came in the chat, that there is no medical need for this if we think about, first, disability justice at the center of our conversations, and that a variety of human experiences are not just valid, but welcome in this world and contribute substantially. But also, people don't need to have genetically related children. There is a strong desire on the part of many. That is something that is part of our social construction of gender, to be certain. But genetically related children is not a medical need. There are also other options. And while, a lot of the work that I do, I know a lot of the work that Amrita does as well, centers around people's desire to have genetically related children, there are options for some people. These are not economically available. There are problems with those models. There is also genetic testing technologies that, again, problems associated with those. But there are many other options to heritable genome editing. There's simply, again, no real need for this.
And maybe just to add, I think one other piece that's important here is to remind us that somebody said, is it in the question, and it was in the chat and then it was removed, saying that there is a medical reason to have it because it will make it less difficult for people who have IVF. And I guess I would say that, I think, again, it's not an easy thing to say for anyone who has been through the process of wanting to become a parent and what it involves. There are people who have deeply strong feelings about this, absolutely. But in a global sense of the issues that have to be dealt with, it does seem that in a world where the vast majority of poor children on this planet literally don't get, as Amrita said earlier, don't get clean drinking water, don't get enough food to eat. I mean, forget about the point that those are the things that then cause them to get malaria or, diarrhea or whatever. It does seem very strange that who is being privileged is essentially between the 1% to 5% of our global economy, who are then enabling themselves to have all these choices, which nobody in the, bottom 20, forget about even bottom 25. I mean, even 50% of the world is just not going to be able to have those choices at all. And so I'm not saying that this is an easy discussion for us to have, but I do think that that is why I began by saying that it has to be situated within the existing power dynamics between those who have and those who don't have. And to be very honest, from what we've seen through this pandemic about how big pharma doesn't really care about the needs of those who are most in need. They actively made sure that people in South Africa didn't get access to the vaccine in enough time. We've had that experience with HIV/AIDS. We've had that experience in every single instance where large private profit-making companies have essentially privatized medicine and have privatized healthcare. So, way before you get to the fancy technologies of editing a gene, you're already in a deeply unequal world in which there is profit driving the outcomes of these companies and not the well-being of either people or planet.
I'm going to take we have only a couple of minutes left, and we have a couple of questions in the Q&A. And whoever wants to jump in, just to explain, I think the question is, please explain how heritable genome editing enables people to have genetically related children. And it doesn't, but these two conversations are important at the same time. Because the desire to have genetically related children is part of what leads people to want assisted reproductive technologies in the first place. But the second question is, which I'm hoping someone can answer, I agree with the points on disability and genetically related children. I'm not so sure these points can be extended to diseases in general. For example, if these technologies would result in less prevalence of a genetically inherited form of cancer, would we think about them differently? Somebody want to respond to that in just our few minutes left?
Maybe I'll try a little bit. This is something to think about for sure. It's a really good question. I think that there's general consensus that acquiring or experiencing cancer is not tremendous, not great, to put it mildly. It's unclear in experiences of genetic modification, when we're talking about heritable genetic modification, that the attempted editing of the germline will result in situations of benefit, of potential, in this case, reduction in the prevalence of disease for future generations. And the only way to know that is to engage in an experiment with future generations, rather than focus on perhaps other ways to prevent or intercede that aren't heritable. And so I don't have what I would say is a satisfying answer to your question, but there are considerations here in terms of the autonomy and capacity of future generations and the decisions that we're making for children in the future. And so, and as well as concerns about human experimentation that's intergenerational. So again, not satisfying at all, but perhaps some issues to contemplate.
Thank you. We're going to wrap this up. I guess I would add just one other thing, is that there are other ways. If we think of how many conditions are actually caused by environment, by toxins, I would like to see us eliminate those causes of harmful conditions before we move forward with more of this. And a whole other session on epigenetics and how that affects our bodies. But we are running out of time. This has been amazing. So much to think about. And I want to hand it back to Katie to kind of wrap up for us.
Thank you so much, Susan, Alana, Amrita, Kavita. your insights, for this provocative discussion. Clearly, there's so much more that we could talk about, and we're so grateful to all of you for being here for this conversation today. Many thanks also to our ASL interpreter, to our captioner, and really to everyone behind the scenes at CGS who's been working so hard to bring this event and all of our previous webinars together. And we really appreciate all of you attending today and at our previous events. And if you're new to the Center for Genetics and Society, we encourage you to check out our website, geneticsandsociety.org. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook and learn more about our work. So thanks again, everyone, and goodbye.